So Anne went to Sunday school and church. Now, Sunday school is done different ways in different traditions. What I'm used to is Sunday school followed by a normal church service. Adults would go in and do a Bible study, and then the children would do a Sunday school. And the Sunday school would have maybe some songs, basic prayers. It's something age appropriate. And then an age appropriate Bible story, because there's parts of the Bible that are just gruesome. But there's other things that are good, happy stories. So you could have a story about Jesus healing a leper, or you could have a story about Noah and the Ark. Noah and the Ark was a great popular one. Anyway, so she went to Sunday school, and they said the book says that she had read the quarterly, and then the teacher asked questions from the quarterly. Now, quarterly means every 3 months or 4 times a year. And so this would be a publication, a newspaper, magazine sort of thing that came out every quarter. And inside of it, there would be the 12, 13, 13, I guess, 13 weeks of lessons for the Sunday school, and it would probably have the Bible verses and daily prayers and things like that. And so it'd come out with all of these things. And whatever it was that they were studying that week, the kids would read it beforehand, and then the teacher would ask them questions. And this is the basic Socratic method, which has been a thing for like 3,000 years, where you have the teacher and they ask a question, the person responds. And the teacher asks questions to refine things. So teacher asks a question and kids give the response back. This as is used all over the place. It's a good way to learn because it forces you to think through things. Then they mentioned going into the church service, and Anne was told to ask Mrs. Lind which pew is theirs. And there's okay. Nowadays, where people sit in church is just kind of a tradition thing where it's like, I always sit in the right hand side in the back, or I sit in the left front, or I sit in the third row, or I sit. And it's like people have their places where they sit, and they all go in and they all sit in the same place, and they always sit there at the same time. Now, the thing is, 400 years ago, you would actually have these little boxes around the pews, not just like lines of benches. You would have this little box, and people would pay for their little box if it was in a good position, pay more for it in a good position. They would put in their own benches and such. This is a little bit past that, but you still have this very strong sense of this is where you sit. Now, a couple weeks ago, there were a bunch of people at church because I'm not sure why. Anyway, church was extra full, and I went and I looked, and my usual place was full, and the backup place was full. And most of the right hand side, I usually sit in the right, kind of off the far right edge, kind of back. But that was all full. I was like, okay, fine, let's just go sit on the left hand side for a change. Farther from the pastor, closer to the music. Anyway, sat on the left hand side. And everyone was like, oh, you decided to come to join us. Just so much, everybody was talking about it. It's like, oh, Mark's sitting on this side this week. And it's like, aren't we good enough for you? Oh, you just. And it's like people on both sides. I was like, oh, I am so embarrassed. Which is kind of, I guess, why everybody sits in the same spot every week, because otherwise people talk and you don't want. Anyway. And then the next week, I sat back in my normal spot, and they're like, oh, we weren't good enough for you. You went back. It's like, I can't win for losing. Anyway, so talked about reading Revelations chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. Now, Revelations is, for the most part, a book of prophecy. In the early church, and admittedly, Revelations is probably the last book written. In the early church, and it was only written about 100 AD. So, in the early church, you would have the church fathers, the disciples, who at that point became the apostles. You would have the apostles writing letters. And so you would have St. Paul fire off a letter to Corinth and saying, this is what you are doing wrong, or this is what you need to do right, or this is what you need to do. And so you would have these letters sent off. And what would happen is so Corinth would get the letter and they would read it out to everybody and they'd make a copy of it and they'd send it over to Ephesus and they would send it over to Colossae and they would send it all over to all of these different places so that one church gets it, they make a copy of it, they send it on and they get another copy and they send, and they send it on. So all of these letters get sent around from church to church. So everyone sees the same things and knows the same things, even if it's not necessarily related to them. And there were a few letters that were directed towards a particular person. The letter of Philemon was directed to Onesimus. And it's like, why is it called Philemon if it's being written to Onesimus? And it was written by Paul. So Paul wrote a letter to Onesimus. And the whole letter was about Philemon. And Philemon was a runaway slave. And St. Paul was like, you got to take him back and you got to treat him kindly. And Onesimus, because Paul said he should, did. He took Philemon back. He freed Philemon. Philemon, as I said, was a slave, and slavery was a totally normal thing in Rome. There were slaves of every color and every race. You could have black people owning white people and white people owning black people, and it just didn't matter. You have citizens and you have slaves. So anyway, Philemon was a slave and Onesimus owned him. But they were both Christians. And Onesimus decided, okay, I will free Philemon. And they were both in the same church because, they live in the same place. And back then it was like one church per town. Anyway, they were both in the same church. And Philemon actually ended up becoming the bishop of that church. So in a lot of ways, he ended up being over Onesimus. But that's a side thing. Back to Revelations. Revelations starts out with 7 letters to 7 churches. So it's like church 1 this, church 2 that, church 3 this. And so you have, the first 3 chapters are letters to 7 churches because they're doubled up. And Revelation, and the guy only read 2 verses. And I mean, 2 verses is not much. And the 2 verses of Revelations 3. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard. Hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know what time I come for you. So this is great topic for a sermon, shouting wake up, and here you have Anne almost falling asleep during it. Here you have Marilla saying that this is a dull... I mean, the whole thing is wake up, because that particular church had a problem where they were starting to fall away, and falling away was a big problem at that point because, as I said, this was written about 100 AD. This was written by John, and he was the last of the apostles. He was the last person to know Jesus. And here he is writing a letter saying, keep the faith. Wake up. Don't fall asleep. And so, he is the last one alive out of everybody. And so everyone was like, the world should have ended. Jesus should have returned by now. And so that's part of the context of Revelation. So that's part of why John was saying, wake up. Now, the Sunday school teacher wanted Anne to memorize the 19th paraphrase. Now, the word paraphrase means to tell in a simplified way. So a lot of what I'm doing here is I'm paraphrasing things. And so when you take a huge, big story, like I could say War and Peace. So if I were to take War and Peace and paraphrase it, I'd say, okay, there's this Russian guy, Peter, who thought he was related to Napoleon, and he was all self-aggrandizing, and a whole bunch of stuff happened that wasn't really important. And that's War and Peace, and that's a paraphrase of War and Peace, and that's an oversimplification of War and Peace. Your dad could probably give you a better paraphrase of it, or you could sit down and read all 1,000 pages of it. The thing is a doorstop. Even in paperback, the thing is just like a chunk. But paraphrase also has a more specific meaning. So the Church of Scotland had this book. It was the Psalter and Paraphrases. So what a lot of churches did in the modern times, when everyone could print books and, you could have books everywhere, is that they would take the hymns and they would put them together, or they would take the Psalms and they would put them together. And this Scottish Psalter and Paraphrase was an early hymn book, and hymns are songs. So what they had was they had all of the Psalms, and then they had other Bible verses that were kind of poetry, and they put them all together so that you have this hymn book where you could go through, you could open it up, and you could read the words and sing through if you don't, if you didn't have the whole thing memorized. Is there are 150 Psalms. Book of Psalms is just huge. Plus, then you had another 60 or so paraphrases on top of that. And it's a lot to know. And these were slightly different versions of the Psalms and slightly different versions of the Psalms and the Bible verses that went into the paraphrases because they were set up to be sung. Now, Psalms were sung in Hebrew. But when you translate that over to English, you have to make choices about, well, do you want to rhyme? Do you want the words to match what each word means? So it's like, do you want a word for word translation? Do you want to get a sense of the thing? Do you want it to match the purpose? And so the paraphrases in Psalter here leaned more towards matching the purpose. So the text was generally there, but the words were somewhat out of order, but it gave you the sense, it gave you the feeling, and because it's a translation, it's never going to be exact. I can say something in German, I can say something in English, they're not going to mean the exact same thing, even if they are the same, if the words mean the same thing. French, Chinese, Hebrew, Italian, nothing will line up perfectly. You might occasionally get something like French and Spanish or French and Italian to line up perfectly, or Dutch and German. But even then, there's going to be some drift. There's going to be some differences. So, going from Hebrew, which is right to left, and English left to right, it's totally different roots, totally different philosophies of words. So it isn't going to line up perfectly. Anyway, the 19th paraphrase, I looked it up, is Isaiah 9, 2 through 8. And this is a bit of Bible verse that is often used around Advent. And it starts out, the people who dwelt in darkness have seen a great light. So this is used in Advent. That's in the beginning of December, end of November, beginning of December. It's the 4 weeks before Christmas. And this is used before Christmas because Advent is a dark time. The days are getting shorter. The nights are getting longer. It's a very dark season, and it's the people who have dwelt in darkness have seen a great light. So this is one of the Old Testament verses which foretells Christ's coming. And so Anne had to memorize it. And she liked it because of the legions of Midian, the squadron, I can't remember the word, but the group of soldiers of Midian being destroyed. And she's like, yes, destruction! Yeah, metal! Anyway, so she was happy. She was kind of happy about that because it sounds so tragical. The last thing is puffed sleeves. Puffed sleeves were a big thing back then. Because one of the things that people do to show off having money at certain times was they had excess fabric. So you'd have women with all of these voluminous dresses. So you'd have a dress with like 10 petticoats underneath it that just like poofs it out. And they would have these puffed sleeves. And they would have sleeves puffed here and sleeves puffed in the middle and sleeves puffed down by the wrist and extra stuff flaring out around the wrist. And then they would have a lace sleeve over top of that. And it would just be this huge monstrosity ball of fabric. And Marilla's like, I don't have the money. I don't have the extra fabric to make puffed sleeves. And, Marilla is a sensible person. And she's a sensible person. She's like, nope, don't need that. Just need to keep the arms warm. Just got to get them covered. And so Anne's dress was very much like that. It was probably a little bit better than a potato sack. The fabric was definitely, well, the fabric was better, but, the whole design was, it just, and there's nothing wrong with that. Personally, I kind of like the look, but anyway, it was very plain, very modest, and functional. And Marilla was all about the function, and Anne wants the bouquet of flowers and the ribbons and the. So, Anne and Marilla are very different people when it comes to what they want and how they see fashion and fabric.